It's a treat to have Rachel with us tonight, Dr. RBF. I like that. I'm not sure I've called you that before, but I kind of like that. It's a good way to frame it. Even though she's a Michigan grad, we bonded. Scott and Rachel and I have kind of swam in the same circles, and Rachel has been kind enough to join us tonight. Clinical psychologist, optimal performance, works with executives and families, children. We are, framing the week around growth, as you all know. But when I spoke with Rachel, we thought that it might probably be more interesting to at least explore concept of grief. What does grief do to us? What does grief feel like? How do we grow potentially with grief? And I think, I'll start with a quick story that Scott and I, back in March, we were running a training in Florida when COVID hit, and we went back home and we decided to build a course together. And, what started was our first slide was of an elephant. And, we wanted to start with that as the elephant in the room being loss. And I know, as somebody who works with a lot of high functioning people, and many of you are high functioning as well, that many people that I work with pivoted really quickly and, just adapted. And even us, Scott and I, we just pivoted. But the reason that I thought that was a good starting point, number one, was this was unprecedented times that we were dealing with. And number two, I think sometimes it can be really misleading to adapt so quick. And I noticed for myself, every time I put that slide up, and the slide had the stages of grief, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. And we would start there as a check-in and really kind of try to see if we could identify where we were: anger, bargaining, acceptance, the whole lot. And I really don't know 7 months later if much has changed in that way. So I guess I sometimes I feel a little uncomfortable with this week and just the idea of growth without identifying and making space and bringing some light to all the things that we have potentially lost in way of life, not going to the coffee shop, grandparents, friends, a lot, right? Travel, etc. So that's really why I think this is an important place for us. If we're going to grow, we have to be honest with where we are. So just sort of framing it that way. Rachel, can we start with that? And, and it doesn't have to be the stages of grief, but just how you experienced all of this, and maybe just from a clinical perspective, what you've seen and how you're kind of framing it for people you work with and just in general.
Sure. I mean, first of all, I just want to say I'm super happy to be here with you guys. I just love Scott and Damon and was so happy when they're like, can you come talk to our people? So I'm really happy to be here. And I hope this will be a conversation. So please, put stuff in the chat box or ask me questions, because I think it's much more interesting that way. I've gotten used to doing this on Zoom in the past few months, but it really is a great opportunity for you to ask questions and for us to have a conversation. So really, please, if you're thinking something, if you have a thought or a question, please jump in. The first thing that I wanted to sort of touch on, Damon, when you were saying about how you were able to pivot, right? And pivoting is great, but pivoting doesn't mean that you don't also have grief, right? Because grief is a human experience. You cannot be human and not have some feelings of grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, as you were saying, came up with these 5 stages, back in 1969. If you haven't read her book on death and dying, it's little, sort of like me, like little but powerful, right? Like it's really stood the test of time. Interestingly, though, in all of these years, intervening years, they haven't actually been able to operationalize and sort of prove statistically that these stages exist. Right? But the reason why the book has had such staying power is because everybody relates to it, right? And there are these 5 stages, right, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, right? But it's not like you go, here's 1, and then 2, and then 3, 4, 5, right? You could go 1 and then go to 5, and then back to 3, and then stay in 4 for a really long time, and then back at 3 for a second, and then so it's really an individualized process. And as individualized as it is also completely universal. Right? And so what it feels like is totally kind of depends on where you're at. Right? So at the beginning of this whole ordeal, back in like March, April, maybe even May, I realized I kept waking up every day and thinking, oh my God, I'm here again. And that is actually a really common experience for people who are grieving like the loss of a loved one, where they will say, they'll wake up in the morning, they'll say that's the worst part of their day because they have to remember that the person is not there. And so that was really my first sign to myself, like, oh, I'm grieving something. Right? Because grief doesn't like, it's not like, doesn't come out and like, you don't have like an emoji sticker that says like, you're grieving now, right? It's much more subtle. And in terms of, I think this is a little bit going to answer your question, Scott, that you posed earlier, but maybe not entirely. But in terms of grief in the body, right? People use the phrase, I'm heartbroken, right? Because we really feel it here, or we also feel it in our guts, right? Because our gut is where all of our neurotransmitters are made, right? And so all of the things, all the chemicals that make you feel things, happy, sad, overwhelmed, anxious, are actually all created in your guts. And so we say that we're heartbroken, but it's really more like we're brain broken, because it really affects you on a body level, but we're connected. Our bodies and our minds are not separate, right? So what happens when your brain experiences the loss, it becomes a massive, massive stressor, right? And with the stress, there's the release of cortisol. And cortisol is really helpful in tiny little bursts, right? Cortisol is the adrenaline that gets you out of bed in the morning. If you don't have enough cortisol, you're not going to get up, right? But unlike a brief temporary stressor, grief is really, it's a long-term thing that means that you're sort of staying in this fight or flight mode for a really long time. Okay. Does everybody know what I mean when I say fight or flight? Everybody knows about that? Okay. If you have questions, let me know. But we're in this like fight or flight mode for a really long time, which means you have this overload of cortisol, you have this overload of adrenaline because you're on watch. Like, what else am I going to miss? Right? I'm scared because there's this thing that I'm used to having, whether it's a person or an activity or a way of taking care of ourselves, right? That's gone. And in the long run, it can really make your immune system falter, right? That's why when people experience a major loss, they often get sick afterwards, or often for long-term couples, if one of them dies, the other one dies very, very quickly. Actually, my great-grandparents were married. They were, born in Russia. They got married at like 16, right? And my mother grew up with them in New York, and she said they hated each other, right? By the time she was around, they just like absolutely hated each other. They like were constantly bickering at each other. But when my great-grandfather died at 80 something, he lived quite long time. My great-grandmother said, "I'm done," and literally went to bed and died.
Wow.
Right? Because we can talk about all the connected, there's like a lot of connection and all of that, but like, I think she was just overwhelmed with grief, and was like, as much as I said I hated this person, they had been together for, 70 years. Right? So grief really does have a deep, deep placement in the body, right? And you were referring to the Bessel van der Kolk, the body keeps the score. It's really true, right? It for grief makes us feel run down. It has our like amygdala being overactive, right? And it also, when the amygdala is overactive, when you're in that like high stress mode, fight or flight, what also happens is it kind of shuts down the part of the brain that's called the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, and that's the emotion regulator part of your brain. So that's the part of your brain that's like helping you kind of figure out how to respond to something. And that's why people who are grieving often feel like they're sort of in slow motion, right? They feel like they have a brain fog, or they feel like they're super, super irritable, right, about something that doesn't feel that important.
Right.
Right.
As you're talking, Rachel, one of the things I'm thinking about your great grandparents and your great grandmother passing so soon, or soon afterwards. There's a part of it too. It's like I wonder how much is tied to the fact that I no longer have meaning. Like my meaning was to be a pain in his ass, and now I don't have that
That's
purpose.
what my mother says.
Yeah, and so, but what I think so fascinating is that there was an HBR article that came out earlier in the spring that was talking about the stages of grief, and they had a sixth one in there. It was on meaning. Some other gentleman had written about it and even asked Kubler-Ross or the family of Kubler-Ross if he could add that in, and they did. But that idea of putting meaning to the loss or the grief kind of, says how that could shape. And it really resonated with a lot of the clients that I worked with back in DC in terms of how can we make sense of this all? And again, when we talk about sense making, it's not just a rational exercise. It is a physical exercise of sense making. Like, what am I feeling right now? And more importantly, how is this going to help me? How am I going to learn from this? But that's also helps to kind of mitigate some of the amygdala responses around is just making sense. What can I learn from this, and activating the higher brain in this process? Because when I think about growth and what we're talking about grief as it relates to flow, like where do we kind of accept the grief to be able to move forward and get back to that state of optimal, which in our definition is just being able to do the next best thing, the next best step. And so like my father-in-law passed away in May of this year, and it was great to just lean into the grief, but also know that my next best step was to just have a good cry and be okay with that too. So there's just a lot as you're talking circling in my head. So yeah, I know I just had a brain vomit there on you guys, but it was just packing a lot into this.
There are two thoughts that I have sort of bouncing off of that. One is that the chemical makeup of our tears is different when we cry from something that is emotionally laden versus physical pain. Right? And so it tells us that there's actually a purpose behind the tears, right? They're actually releasing some of those neurochemicals that we are like just at that point generating too much of. Right. And then, you said something, and I realized this was just, a brain vomit, but you said something about getting through the grief. Right. And if there's anything that I hope people can take away from this conversation today, it's really that like grief is a process and it's really individual, and you can't do anything more sometimes than just kind of be in it, right? And like and every feeling has a beginning, a middle, and an end if we actually allow the feeling to run its course. But the problem for most folks, at least that I see in my work, right? And I'm willing to like put it out there. It's not just people I see, pretty willing to like on this. But the problem is not actually the feeling, right? Because all emotions are just, there's no ethical or moral relationship to feelings. Feelings just are, right? The problem comes in actually with our relationship to the feeling. So when we feel grief and then we're like, oh, I'm not supposed to be feeling this because I wasn't that close to that person, or, oh, I shouldn't be grieving the fact that I can't get a pedicure now because I still have my job, right? That's actually not helpful. That's actually getting in the way of us being able to just have the feeling.
That's an interesting concept right there. And it's something, this might be a bit of a brain vomit as well. My best friend passed away of leukemia about 5 years ago, and I literally watched him go through the whole year-long process and kind of wither and die. And right after he died, it was incredibly discombobulating because I felt nothing. I was supposed to be the person that was going to go and give the big speech and talk about his life at the funeral, and everybody was looking at me just because we were brothers and I had nothing, and it was so uncomfortable. And it literally, Rachel, took me years. And I became sort of comfortable within this space. It almost became like, you think about like growth, like the pains of change and homeostasis, and how it's kind of difficult sometimes to allow ourselves to continue to grow. It's like the cigarette smoker that knows that they don't want to smoke, but as soon as they're under stress, they go and have a cigarette. Even though they know it's not something they should do, it comforts you in the moment. And I became comfortable in this numb state. It became the new normal for me. And I think a couple of days ago I posted, I had a time with some clients and they responded with something emotional in a good way. And I laid down on the floor and started crying just 2 nights ago. And I now view that as healthy. Like I view that as I am releasing whatever my body clenched and held on to is really, truly coming out now, and not just necessarily on that huge traumatic incident, but to your question, to your point around, I shouldn't be grieving a pedicure. That's a small thing. It's my understanding that there is no metric around this either, right? It's not like, oh, that person was in war, so they're on the grief scale 8 or 9. My grief is only because my cat died. That should be a 2 or 3.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about just sort of the fact that I think also this is something that we do a lot. We judge.
Oh, well, we're so judgy. I mean, we're so judgy, right? And that just doesn't help anybody with anything, right? So I'm really glad that you actually brought up that point in particular about the numbness, because it's a really common experience. And numbness isn't a sign that there's something wrong, right? It isn't proof that you don't care enough or as much as someone else, right? You can attest to that, right? But if we have to respect our brain's process, right? It's not always okay to just let everything out for whatever reason. One of the metaphors that I think a lot of therapists use is like the Coke bottle, right? If you shake up a Coke bottle, right? Like if you just open it, everything's going to go everywhere. Right? But if you open it more slowly, then you're going to be able to open it like with more control and maybe not lose all the seltzer, right? Or whatever it is that you're drinking. Now, and I think the really important piece is that some people have to do it one way and some people have to do it the other way, and like not to judge yourself or someone else because of that process. Right. And then when, I know you guys have been talking about trauma, and I think it's impossible to not talk about trauma when we're talking about grief. And so there's something else that you said that I wanted to touch upon, which is there are two ideas with trauma that I think are really helpful. One is Mark Epstein. He talks about little t versus big T, right? And little t is like these everyday kinds of traumas that happen to us, like, something that's like very sort of normal, but continues to happen regularly, versus big T, which is like an explosion or war or, you're assaulted, right? So both of those experiences are traumatic, but they're traumatic in different ways. And the other thing that I think is really helpful to keep in mind is Gabor Mate. And he, talks about trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you. Right. And that's why we can look at people who have been through these really, really traumatic experiences and seem to be able to make meaning and be okay. Yeah. Right. So another really good book is Viktor Frankel's Man's Search for Meaning, right? Where, he talks about like he was in a concentration camp, or I think he was actually in 2 or 3. And he's like looking around because some people are just functioning, even with all this horror going on. And some people were not able to. And what he was able to kind of make sense of is the fact that if you have a why, you can tolerate almost anyhow.
Yeah. It's interesting because Rachel, in Butte County, where I live, and I think some of the people on the call are from, we've had the campfire that happened a couple years ago. It'll be 2 years, November 8th. And then we just had the bear fire that took out Berry Creek. And I was on a call today with a woman who basically has not only lost her home in the campfire, but then had to be evacuated in the most recent episode. And so there's just trauma, compounding trauma. And I think, I was teaching a class yesterday, and, I don't know how you would feel about this, but I still think about the relation of flow and trauma is on the same continuum. It just it's the inversion of the other. And so helping people kind of get detached. And one of the things that I read through Stephen Porges' work is that if you want to get people unstuck from a traumatic experience, they have to pursue something novel. But in that pursuit of something novel, they have to feel really safe. And so I'm just curious to know, how do you help, or what sort of guidance would you create if someone's stuck? What kind of questions do you ask of them to kind of think about as they kind of think about that next best optimal step for them? If I'm feeling stuck because I've been traumatized and I'm numb or whatever, what are some of those little nudges that you would maybe help someone kind of step into something that's novel and new so they can kind of get unstuck in that pursuit of getting back to their best self, if that's even possible?
Well, I wouldn't say getting back to your best self. I would say moving forward to your best self,
or to your new self. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Because I think about it like we're always growing.
Yeah.
Just when we think about growth, we often think about it being pretty. And I don't know. I saw this meme somewhere. It's like butterflies be like caterpillars turn to like an oozy mess before they become the butterfly. Right. So life is just painful, right? That's just that's just the sad truth. Like there's just no getting through it otherwise. So, and I think the novelty is a really interesting idea for 2 reasons. And I'm thinking specifically also with COVID, right? Novelty is important in terms of people feeling energized, but you need to also feel safe.
Right.
And that's really hard right now, to figure out how to have a novel experience that feels safe. Because, the thing that's really traumatic for a lot of us, or all of us to some degree, around COVID is that it's it's everywhere, right? You cannot go anywhere that people are that is safe, really, and you can't see it. Right?
Mm.
So you can protect yourself in whatever way you think is possible, but if you're going to be out in the world, you don't know where it exists, right? And so this idea of safety feels even more important. And so I talk with people really about like, how can you connect? How can you focus on relationships, right? Whether that means therapy, grief groups, talking to a friend. How can you help yourself feel safe and comfortable? How do you remove stressors? Right? What can you kind of create in your life that makes it feel better?
Right. Well, just asking that question, you're putting them in the driver's seat because you're putting them back in something they have good potential control over. And and I think a lot of this stuff we have absolutely no control over. We're helpless, and that can be paralyzing as well. I'd be curious to know, like from the people that are working, like Rhodey or Andrea, who have staff and that you're supervising. I'd just be curious to know, what are some of your staff experiencing as it relates to this thing that we're all going through as a leader. I'd just be curious, what you guys are doing or what you're hearing.
I would say, as far as like with my staff and those within the organization that both Andrea and I work for, is that because our work pretty much continued relatively normally, and for those that have had no health situations, it hasn't been a real disruptive process. And so we've continued to move forward. We've had kind of what the future looks like in regards to, we're doing it now, it could continue. We don't have a definitive point in time when it's going to end, but yet, the morale actually has continued fairly well from what I've experienced. Andrea, I'll let you jump in and share as far as with your particular staff.
Yeah, I would say it's been a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, quite frankly, some folks seem to be handling the change relatively well. Now, of course, it's a work setting, right? So to the degree that they feel safe sharing their concerns, that will temper it. But, I had a conversation with one of my team members just yesterday, and this was a team member that I thought had been rolling along quite quickly, and doing very well. And the conversation we had showed me that might not have been the case. And I appreciated the discussion about the grief cycle, because I almost feel like we're in a washing machine, right? That we keep tumbling through this cycle over and over again. And he was tumbling back, and what had happened is his son had been exposed. They had to take COVID tests, but now his son couldn't go to school. And all of a sudden, this reaction just seemed very disproportionate and out of character for this individual. And I could tell he was battling something internally, and my assumptions regarding his mental health were wrong. And I think it goes back to the point we've been talking about, is the importance of maintaining connections and continuing to reach out to people. And the other conversations I've had with folks throughout this cycle is almost feeling guilty, because here we are, we've been able to continue to work. Our livelihood is maintained. As Rhodey said, we've largely been able to continue as is. We've had no cut in benefits, all these things that we should be enormously grateful for, but yet they're still angry and sad and don't know how to grieve the losses, whether it be the loss that their kids experienced, or the loss that they had a big trip that they wanted to take, or even the perception of a loss of freedom and autonomy to make the choice about what stores they want to go to and whether they want to wear a mask, all those types of things. It's been interesting. Some people have really, really struggled with that, and almost feel shamed, that people won't allow them to express their grief, because they should be grateful.
Yeah,
Right.
I think Rachel, as you kind of mentioned before, is in that grief process, there's the beginning, middle, and end. I think we're kind of stuck in the middle at this point, because we don't know when it's going to end. We don't have a point in time. It could be longer, it could be shorter, hopefully it's shorter, but think that's what I find a lot, is that we're kind of stuck in that middle of that continuum. We've begun it, we're in the middle, but we don't know, we're just kind of continuing on this plateau and not knowing when we're either going to jump off of it or we're going to be able to climb out of it.
Right.
Yeah, I was just talking to one of your colleagues in another division yesterday who's lost 3 family members. Her cousin's in the hospital, who's the same age as her. And, you know, she said that it was the first time that she's been able to share that. So I'm wondering if she's thinking about her colleagues and maybe she's not hitting the mark because she's dealing with all this other grief and people are judging, you know, so there's just all this complexity. And so how do you grow? Maybe it goes back to what you said, Rachel, about how do we grow in an area? I think the best way to make it safe is to not judge what people are experiencing. You know, because again, people are probably judging her, but not understanding anything that she's going through. And then that compounding effect where she has to, talk to some of these people and they're judging her, or she feels judged by them. It makes it hard.
When I talk about judgy, the worst judge usually is yourself, right? Like you think other people are judging you, but actually it's really what's happening between your own ears.
Yeah.
That's kind of what jumps out at me as well when we try to articulate growth, or when we even try to articulate feelings. As you say, all of a sudden we have often whatever the base feeling is lost in translation when our own language grabs onto it and tries to just define or make sense of what it is that we're feeling. And, that even the language around, beginning, middle, and end, it does feel like, most of us, without these larger events that have occurred in our lives, we feel that we have some semblance of control over where we're going. And I think that this situation has really, forced us to remember how limited our actual control really is. And I think personally, the remedy has always kind of defaulted back down to, and I think it touches on novelty a little bit, that do the small things big, where it's safe for me to stretch and brush my teeth and take a shower. But often when normal life, I'm not present when I'm doing those things. I'm brushing my teeth, but I'm already out the door. I'm already thinking about the day. And I find that really at the end of the day, that the real therapy is coming back into the present moment. And I think when I'm capable of doing that, I have so much more compassion and empathy for the world around me and for myself, so that these small movements can take on new meaning. I can hit my markers not by Q1 goals, but by was I able to stay present while I brushed my teeth? Was I able to listen when my daughter was sharing a story? And at least for me, kind of the distillation back to, this is the only place that we are ever, is here now. And around that concept of growth, I do also think sometimes we get duped into language around growth, that I am creating a narrative that I'm growing. And it sounds like, Rachel, what you're saying is that, there's nowhere to go necessarily. It's not some linear stepping, ladder that when I get up here, I'm going to feel, better than how I felt before. How is it possible for us to know that we're growing? What does that even look like? I mean,
I think by default growth just happens. It's sort of what happens when, you're not paying attention. I think the question is, can you be more intentional at least in my mind, right? Can you be more intention about the direction you want to grow in? I do think that I think for a lot of folks, right, a big issue is this sense of control that we think we are supposed to have, right? And I really feel that for the most part, if you can kind of like give up that fallacy, you're actually going to be much happier, you know, in the long run. Because I mean, that's what COVID has really shown us, right? I don't think, with the exception of people who really got sick, right, or who lost their jobs and their, you know, really their economic situation has really changed. For most or many of us, COVID hasn't really changed. It's just changed the container, right? And so all of the things that we struggled with before are the things that we're struggling with right now. It's just that much more intense because it's a much smaller container. Right? So yeah, bang for buck, the most helpful thing you can do is sit down and meditate, for sure. Right? It's cheap. There are no negative side effects unless you have some like real psychiatric like schizophrenia. Like then there can be some sort of negative side effects from it. But if you're not schizophrenic, there really aren't any negative side effects from trying to sit and, you know, pay attention.
So with that, are you speaking of, you know, there's you know, like a fixed point type of TM meditation where you're on a mantra specifically, some, you know, or even breath?
I think it's really much broader than that. TM works for some folks, mindfulness works for some folks. I've been most recently really into sound meditation, because sound is something that, just like your breath, it just kind of comes. You don't really have much control over it. You can't stop it. It's external to you, right? But it creates irritation or it makes us feel soothed, right? And so just watching that process of like what noise is coming up and what's my reaction to it. And there's reams of, you know, really good research, right? If you meditate 20 minutes a day, meditating 20 minutes a day has been proven to reverse heart disease.
Wow.
Right?
Jeez.
But the caveat is that you actually have to sit and meditate for 20 minutes a day, which is not that easy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I read some research on, you know, I think it was college age kids that, given the choice between sitting with their own thoughts for, I want to say 10, 15 minutes, or giving themselves an electrical zap, that like 60 or 70% of them chose the zap.
Right. So there's a really good, really well-known study done by NIH with combat vets who have PTSD. And they tested, you know, I think it was an hour of yoga a day versus taking an SSRI, right? Taking a antidepressant. And what they found is that the results were equal, right? People felt just as good on the medication as they did doing an hour of yoga a day. The problem was that you had to continue to do an hour of yoga a day and people would rather just take a pill. Right. So there are, you know, I don't remember if Scott or Damon, which one of you asked, but there are lots of things you can do. Right. Right. But you have to do them. Right. So we know that aerobic exercise, 10 to 20 minutes a day of aerobic exercise is protective for mood. Right. I'm not talking about weight loss. I'm not talking about like cardiovascular training. I'm talking about like getting out, running, walking, riding your bike, just enough to get your heart rate up, right? Just enough to get you to sweat a little bit, to get your breathing engaged, right? And that is protective of mood.
Serotonin and all the, yeah.
Emiliano?
Yes, thank you. I actually have a question for you, Rachel. I'm not sure how to ask the question, but let me try.
Okay.
So we have been talking a lot about the different phases in the grief process, and also when we experience trauma and the feeling of being victimized, right? And also we're talking about growth and post-traumatic growth. What is interesting for me is how we move from one to the other, right? Because let's imagine that I'm suffering some PTSD due to one specific event or trauma that I experienced in my life. Let's imagine for a moment that I found out that there is a pill that I take every day and takes away all my PTSD symptoms. So I experience, my life goes back to kind of normal. If that happens, I agree that I don't have this inner sensation of a growth. Is that I didn't learn much about my experience because the solution came from the outside and took away the things that I didn't like, and I'm back to this kind of normal. But if I'm proactive and I do things to deal with the PTSD and I develop an inner belief, behaviors, an inner transformation that helps me to overcome the root of my trauma, then I feel empowered. Then I feel a sensation of growth. But I'm curious about how you view this psychological, because I totally see that in order to grow, there is a psychological change in the individual. It doesn't just happen to you. There are actions and steps that are involved, or at least is how I see it. I would like to hear from you.
So it's a really interesting question. And I don't want to, so I certainly have a bias, right? I am a psychologist. I am not a psychiatrist. I do not prescribe medication. So I definitely have a bias, but I also don't want to throw out the importance of medication, right? Medication can be not only important, but life-saving for folks, right? So although I do think that if you're on medication, you should also be doing the work, right? So for some people, you know, if you have PTSD, you're stuck, right? And so my hope would be that if you took a pill that helped you, that would enable you then to be able to do the work that you needed to do to kind of make whatever change. But sometimes people have, you know, really significant trauma and their brains have shifted and they're not going to be able to like do the work they need to do without some external help. Does that make sense? So, you know, and how much work anyone.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, let me reframe the conversation. I used the example of the pill just to exemplify, not to go into the conversation of the medication.
Yeah.
But there is a change in their internal psychology when we move from being victimized to feeling power, and I believe that in that change is where we experience this personal growth. And sometimes can be more tangible that's something that just happened to you.
Right.
And some of the suggestions that we're talking about meditation or practicing yoga or doing different things might help to move from one to the other, right? Or at least is how I'm translated into my own language.
Right.
And
I mean,
understand
for sure. When people come to me, I tell them from the get-go, right? I don't have a magic wand. I don't have a crystal ball. I am not going to be able to fix you, right? First of all, I don't believe anybody is broken, so I don't think anybody needs to be fixed, right? But if we're talking even about growth, like the work, you know, the onus is on you. The work is with you. I have, sort of real skill is being able to listen, to sort of understand people are having conversations on multiple levels. So we say one thing, but there's really like multiple things that are happening, right? And helping folks kind of make connections so that they can feel empowered, right? So that they can understand, oh, right, if I, an hour of yoga feels impossible, but I can maybe do 3 minutes of breath. And that's an okay place to start, right? Or I can say, or like somebody comes to me and, I can say to them, like, this is what I'm spending a lot of time talking to people about, right? And these are like some folks who are like, super high functioning, like, heads of whatevers, right? Like big, important folks who still feel like I come home at the end of the day and I'm feeling depleted and I'm feeling really irritated with my kids. And like, all I want to do is like, climb into bed. And when I say, yeah, that seems normal right now, like that in and of itself can be really relieving. Right. And then we can talk about like, all right, so what's your sleep look like? How are you feeding yourself? How much water are you drinking? What exercise are you doing? Like all of those things, but I can't make anybody do it. I can barely make myself do it, right? So I'm not going to be able to do it for anybody else, but I certainly am happy to sit and talk about the ideas.
I love that too, because it feels like you're framing it in a way that allows perspective. And I think when I feel stuck, it's because I'm trapped behind my own eyes and I'm trapped in my story. And Emiliano used the word victim, and I feel the world's happening to me. And when I somehow can shift perspective, then I potentially have a slightly different insight about what's really going on. And that small glimmer is a place where then I can make maybe another informed decision or a different kind of decision. And I also, Rachel, I think that 3 minutes of breathing example is so powerful because it's not 1 hour of yoga a week that's going to do it. It's 3 minutes of breathing every day. And I think that begins to shift and allow us to make a different perspective. I used to do a lot of traveling, kind of world traveling. And I remember feeling like anxiety if I was in one place, thinking about what I was going to do in the next place. And so I stopped doing that. I just said, just get to the next place and then figure it out. Like, then look around. And in a way, I kind of equate it to this, where, do a little work and then look around and notice we can shift state fairly quickly. And as you're talking, Rachel, this, science about reversing heart disease and such with meditation. So, the idea of just sort of being open to making small changes on this more of a drip basis seems like it's a really effective way to go.
There's also a conversation that's going on in the chat that I just sort of looked at and I wanted to respond to, which is going along with what you're saying, Damon, in terms of like, these small changes are where it's at. Like growth takes time. And to go back to this question of what you were saying, Scott, about like, this continuum with, trauma and flow, right? The part of the flow cycle that nobody wants to talk about. Struggle.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to talk about that. That's not sexy, right? That's not fun, right? But that's actually where we have to reside. Right. And that's
and accept it, because I do think people struggle with the struggle. They goes back to the judgment. They're judging that they're struggling, and so it's some sort of narrative on their character, their strength, or whatever. And I was in a class with a few people in a class yesterday just around, just like struggling as you know, we've learned is not optional. So it's really, what are the tools to really help us struggle? And on the other side, the other bookend is also recover. Like, what am I doing at the end of the day? And you know, it's a series of then choices that I get to make that I can do around, you know, that's what Emiliano does, you know, community resiliency stuff. And it's just giving people the tools and then giving them the space to recognize, you know, are my choices serving me, you know? And it's simple as that, and know that things are going to come up, but don't try to create a routine. Just say, here are some of the practices that I want to integrate into my day, because I know it'll do a good pattern interrupt for me, or it'll help me focus on something. But I'm just trying to keep, to Damon's point, just try to keep things simple, you know. It's been useful, but I think I just see people unwilling, well, not unwilling, just struggling with the idea of struggling as a matter of that they're broken. And it's just not the case at all.
Right.
You know, accept the struggle, you know.
Right. Right. I mean, that's what I end up saying to people all the time in my practice, right? Like, they're telling me this litany of experiences and sort of really in judgment, sitting in judgment of themselves, right? And ultimately it's like, well, yeah, that just means you're human.
Yeah.
Right? Like, welcome. I can't change that. Right? Yeah. The human experience is one of struggle. Yeah. Right? And connection helps. Right? Yeah. And recovery helps. And so I have been telling people from the beginning, right? Whatever it is that you do for your recovery process, you have got to double, triple, quadruple down on that right now.
Yeah.
Right. Especially because so many of the things have been taken from us. And so whatever it is you can do, or whatever it is that's like novel, right? Like, so many more people are exercising, like in the streets. Like, I was commenting on this to one of my kids yesterday. Every day this week, I have seen somebody, like an adult, right? Like a real bona fide grown-up, jumping rope in their driveway every day for the past week.
You're all Cinderella dressed in yellow.
Exactly. And my 8-year-old was like, jumping rope is very first grade. And so then we had a conversation about how it's actually really good aerobic exercise and blah, blah, blah. But right, it's like, yeah, people were hiking more, and, you know, boxers, right? We had that whole conversation. So
getting animals, getting dogs.
Oh my God, dogs, the whole dog thing. Mm-hmm.
I want to circle back to Andrea's situation at work, and maybe Rachel, if you could think of maybe a way she could respond. You know, here's this person that seemingly is steady, and then they seemingly, you know, kind of fly off the handle unexpectedly. As supporters, I often, you know, I think it's difficult sometimes to come up with language to show that we hear one another, but we're not telling them or judging them. Or what are some kind of, you know, simple, empathic, you know, compassionate, open-ended ways, especially in a work setting? Yeah. I mean, what kind of, yeah.
On that point, Damon, Mark had written a question around, you know, people seeing what we're doing as metaphysical or Eastern cultural stuff. And so, you know, almost like judging the movement of flow, or trying to help people be okay. But then sometimes their value systems block the effort, you know, of, like, when you say meditation, that can scare people of certain faiths, right? So that kind of stuff kind of, you know, so to your point, I just want to maybe kind of elaborate a little bit further out, or grow a little bit further out, because there are people who feel really uncomfortable because their faith may not allow meditation, or they have something.
Yeah. All right.
Even though prayer is meditation in my view, but that's, yeah.
So I'm super nerdy scientist type. I'm not at all woo-hoo. You know, I see like lots of like heads of hospitals and lawyers, and like people come to me because I'm not like sandals and candles, right? Like I am like a New Yorker. I call it like it is. If you're going to bullshit me, I'm going to tell you, right? So first of all, I think you can say, I do love sandals and candles, but that's not, you know, the persona that I'm putting out. When I'm talking about meditation, right, I am talking about like science with people. and I will give you the reports, and I will, you know, like I'm in Boston, right? Harvard, the Henry Benson Institute, he's the dude that like who found this research about, you know, the connection between heart disease and meditation. So I think you just have to find the language that you're comfortable using in terms of talking about that. And whether it's prayer or meditation or mindfulness or running or whatever it is, you just have to find the words that feel legitimate to you. And not knowing anything about your organization or your particular situation, Andrea, you know, I think what is most helpful is for people to feel that they are heard in a non-judgmental space, right? I think often what we try to do that is the mistake is when we try to intuit what someone else might need, because usually we're projecting onto them what we think we would want, right? And so, you know, circling back to this person and saying like, you know, I heard what you were saying. It's a hard time for all of us. What do you need? How can I, you know, how can I be of help? How can the organization be of help? Really just putting it out there, because sometimes people just need to be heard. They just need to know that it's okay, that like everything feels like a shit show, and like that, you know, that's okay. They don't have to keep up the exterior image that they have projected all this time.
Yeah.
Right. Because what feels most comfortable for us is actually when our insides match our outsides. And when we have to go through the world feeling like we have to just, you know, have this shell up, that's when it just feels really unbearable.
Well, that goes back to that vulnerability, you know, that just allow myself to be vulnerable in the presence of others. And that's scary for a lot of people. I know it has been for me. And just so you know, I made it into a shit opera. So it's not even, it's just way beyond a show. It's an opera. It's like it's beautiful.
You're just really talented. You're just showing off at this point.
That's great advice, Rachel.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Anyone else want, as we're wrapping up, any other questions, comments? Also, you know, we are at day 20 something of doing this program. These kind of drip every day, you know, sharing gratitude and mini wins. And has this program impacted, or does something jump out? Those are a couple of different threads that we could sort of finish up with here.
Mark had an interesting post on the chat around the wall of wins. So I don't know, but Monica, do you have something to add?
Yeah, but I can go after Mark, no problem.
Well, I don't know if Mark's going to be on, but go ahead.
I'm right here, but go ahead, Monica.
Okay, so I was just pondering on, I appreciate how you started out saying that it was kind of misleading when you see somebody pivot quickly and well. And I think that goes back to this judgment thing. And I like to remind myself that people aren't judging me unfairly. They're just judging with what information they have. And especially if I don't give them any, like it often happens in the workplace that I don't give them any, they'll judge with whatever they have. So there's a compassion there to have to yourself as well. And this thing about time to me is really important, because I can relate to that thing about it's misleading. You know, people might think, well, he's all over that grief, you know, look at them, they're just flying and doing stuff. But that doesn't mean that that's not the way you handle grief, or that you're not having to do a lot of work on yourself to be able to be out in the world that way. So I appreciate, you know, what we've been doing in the Flow Challenge, just going back to those little things and recognizing them in myself. And for me, you know, I've just been sitting here thinking about that, you know, how time, if you're doing the work, time, it'll work out in time. You know, you might not do it perfectly every day, but if you're moving in that direction, it'll add up, right? So, thank you.
Well said.
And
Mark?
Yeah, so what I was calling out was, and I know several of us on the call regularly read the Wall of Winds. That's what WOW means, Rachel, and the read. So but what happens in the Wall of Winds, if you were to look at the themes, is for a lot of the wins, even when it's a crappy day or something really obviously did not go well, it was whatever gave them some feeling of pleasure. They're sometimes grabbing for it. Sometimes it's humorous, but I think that's how we cope. It can be just that small of, I did this. I made it to the grocery store, for God's sakes, to other things that can be big, and we start to see their world. That's a coping against the avoidance of pleasure or in the place where you feel nothing. And in psychology, that's really the darkest, deepest part of hell. So the wow is a progress. Excuse me. I'm trying to breathe. So the wow shows how much progress people are making in finding small pleasure in the day. I think that's an enormously powerful thing.
Mm-hmm.
So Rhodey and I will be giving high fives, and along with Damon, and in a few minutes we'll be reading through them, right?
Yes, we will.
And Mark and then Andron.
I want to be mindful of time, and I want to thank you, Rachel, for bringing so much sort of deep science and sort of a clinical perspective, but in just such a real life human way. This really landed with me, and it's given me a lot to just kind of take in, and it's nice to just feel the connection, and the way you normalize just being, and being where we're at is, I think, the thing that really kind of impacted me the most. And so I really appreciate you, and I want to thank you again for being on. We've recorded this as well, so if people want to rewatch, re-listen.
How can people look you up, or are you kind of similar to what Sarah's doing?
Yep. So first of all, thanks, guys. I just love you guys. So I'm happy to have an opportunity to hang out and just chat, because not everybody in my life, surprise, surprise, wants to hear everything I have to say about, grief and trauma and flow. So thank you for that. And yes, I'd be thrilled if people wanted to connect with me. I have a website. I'm on Instagram and Facebook. So it's,
put it on the chat. Would you mind?
I will put it on the chat.
Awesome.
I also, because Damon, you and I were talking about the fact that you were going to record this, I do have a YouTube channel actually. And I have 2 videos that Sarah and I did together at the beginning, sort of March, April, May-ish, sort of talking about all of these things, like how, like the uncertainty of fear and the psychology of something or other. I can't remember the titles now, but they're there. So if you wanted to go check them out, there's, it's there. And if you guys have questions or want to reach out, I'm happy to let's see, how do I do that?
Actually, why don't you just send it to Damon or myself, and we'll just get it out to everybody in the community.
Yeah,
actually,
I think we have it already, Scott. I think
okay. Yeah.
Yosef's got it. Yeah.
DRRBF. That's
your media kit.
That's my website.
Dr. RBF.
Dr. RBF. And just about the YouTube, it's DR.RBF, because I looked it up today, and if you don't put that dot between the DR and the RBF, it takes you to like some dance thing. That's not me. So it's DR.RBF.
Got it.
Thanks.
Period. RBF. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks for making this topic
Thank you.
a growth experience, Rachel. See you guys.
Thanks, Scott. Bye.
Bye-bye.